What's up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker podcast. This is Coach Weasel, and today's episode is on the topic of blockers. It's a concept which many players are confused about. There are some inaccurate beliefs on how blockers should be used and how effective they actually are. We're going to clear up as much of the confusion as we can in this episode of the Red Chip Poker podcast. Let's start with a very quick recap on blocker theory. First of all, what are blockers? It's another name for card removal effects. It's the idea that if we hold a specific card, then we know that our opponent can't hold that same card. So a simple example could be if there are 3 hearts on the board and we have the ace of hearts. Well, we know that our opponent doesn't have the nut flush. It's impossible because we have the ace of hearts. Therefore, he doesn't have it. The basic idea is going to depend on whether we're bluffing or bluff catching. When we're bluffing, we prefer holdings that block our opponent's calling range. So we prefer holdings that block his strong hands. For example, there's a possible straight out there. If we hold one of the cards that would ordinarily be used to make that straight, it means our opponent has less possible combinations of straights. That generally translates to more fold equity, or at least that's how the theory goes. We'll discuss it in a bit more detail in this podcast episode. We also prefer hands that don't block our opponent's folding range. For example, if there is a busted heart draw out there, when we're bluffing the river, it's not ideal to be holding the ace of hearts, as a rough example. That's because we're hoping our opponent was chasing the nut flush draw and it bricked on the river. But when we hold the ace of hearts, there are now less busted flush draws that our opponent is going to be folding on the river. We refer to this as blocking our opponent's folding range. So when bluffing, we want to block our opponent's calling or continuing range. So it could include blocking his raising range, but we don't want to block his folding range. The principles for blockers when bluff catching are very similar. We want to block our opponent's value range. For example, if there's a straight possible, it makes sense to hold one of the cards that would ordinarily make that straight, because then it means our opponent has less value combinations that he's firing. On the flip side, we don't want to block his bluffing range. So if there is a busted straight draw out there, for example, that our opponent is very likely to have and be bluffing with, it's less ideal for us to also hold one of the cards from that busted straight, because it means our opponent is going to have less combinations of busted straights in that scenario. Now, these are not the only situations where blockers are relevant. You can think of other scenarios as well. For example, imagine a situation where we are trying to value bet top pair, top kicker. We fired flop, fired turn, and unfortunately, the flush completes on the river. It's a 2-tone texture, the flush completes. Let's say we have something like ace queen for top pair, top kicker with a pair of queens, but the heart draw completes. However, we hold ace queen with the ace of hearts. We're all of a sudden less worried that our opponent just made the nut flush on the river. It's therefore easier for us to value bet because we have a relevant blocker. Now, I'm hoping that everything we've covered so far sounds fairly straightforward. And that's how blockers are often portrayed, as being straightforward. I would contend that blockers are actually a lot more complex than many players realize. We'll discuss some of the reasons for that. But first of all, let's touch on another basic concept, which is very relevant to the discussion on blockers, and that is the equivalency of bluffs and bluff catches. This is a very useful concept to be aware of. Let's imagine a river situation. Our opponent is firing a polarized range. So that means he has value hands and he has bluffs. And let's just say, for argument's sake, his bluffs are all ace high and worse. And let's just say his value hands are all top pair, top kicker and better, just to give a very simple example. Now, technically, in that scenario, there is no difference between holding top pair second kicker and the absolute weakest possible pair, let's say pocket deuces post flop. And that's because both of those hands beat our opponent's bluffing range, but they lose to his value betting range. In other words, those hands are going to win at exactly the same frequency. Even though one is clearly a lot stronger than the other, top pair good kicker is a lot stronger than absolute worst under pair, but they both win at the same frequency. We can refer to this as equivalency of bluff catchers. Now, the reason why that's not 100% true in practice is only because of card removal effects. We'll find that the exact pair we have, the side card, or even the pair itself, is going to exert different card removal effects on our opponent's range. It's going to subtly change the width of his value betting range relative to the width of his bluffing range. So in theory, bluff catchers are not quite equal. They're going to have fairly similar EVs, but some will be slightly plus EV, some will be slightly negative EV. It just depends on the card removal effect. That's the theory version of things. In a similar way, if we have a perfect polarization with our range when firing the river, if we ignore card removal effects, it doesn't matter which bluff we pick. Assuming our opponent is folding at the same frequency, the EV of all of our bluffs is going to be the same. It's just going to be a function of how much we invest and how much our opponent is folding. However, because of card removal effects, some bluffs will end up being slightly plus EV, whereas some bluffs end up being slightly minus EV. The idea in theory is to fire all of the bluffs that are slightly plus EV as a result of card removal effects, but not bluff the bluffs that will be slightly minus EV as a result of unfavorable card removal effects. So to summarize everything, blockers determine the correct bluffs and bluff catches in theory. This is how the game should work in theory. This is not, however, how the game works in practice, and it's something that many players are not 100% familiar with. They just assume, okay, this is how it works in theory, this is what I need to be doing in practice also. But there are some problems with this theoretical model. It simply doesn't map to what actually happens in practice at the poker tables. Let's list some example problems with this overly theoretical approach to bluff catching and bluffing purely based on blocking effects. The first is, what happens if villain is not playing GTO? Let's think about us bluff catching, and we know our opponent bluffs well below or well above the correct frequency. Perhaps our opponent's supposed to be bluffing the river 30% in a certain situation, and he only bluffs the river 10%. But we look down at our bluff catcher and we see that we have favorable blocking effects. So what should we do in that situation? If players are following an overly theoretical approach to blockers, they'll just make the call anyway. Okay, I have a good blocker, I should bluff catch with this hand. What's actually happening in that situation? Well, if our opponent bluffs 10% on average, it is true that when we hold a favorable blocker, that bluffing frequency will increase in that specific hand. Maybe our opponent's now bluffing 12 or 13% of the time. Problem is, we need him to be bluffing closer to 30% of the time in order to have a profitable bluff catch. Hopefully what we can see is that blockers are completely irrelevant in this situation. None of our bluff catchers are going to be a plus EV defend in this scenario. They're all going to be losing. Similar kind of idea if our opponent bluffs way too much. All of our bluff catchers are going to be plus EV. Even the ones with the worst blockers are going to be plus EV as well. They might make slightly less than the bluff catchers with the very good blockers, but everything's going to be plus EV. If we're purely choosing our bluff catchers based on the blocking effect, we're going to miss a number of plus EV defends against this opponent who's bluffing too much. And if you imagine now that we're the bluffer, we can see a very similar pattern. Imagine we're bluffing, but our opponent folds well below the correct frequency or well above the correct frequency. If you imagine, for example, he just hardly ever folds the river. We don't want to look down at our bluff and say, well, this bluff has a good blocker, I'm going to use this one to bluff. It's true our opponent might fold slightly more if we have a good blocker, but he's hardly ever folding. This is guaranteed to be a minus EV bluff, even with favorable blocking effects. Same thing could be said if our opponent's folding too much. It's true that if we have the worst blocker, our opponent might be folding slightly less, but if him folding slightly less is still way more frequently than he should be folding, we very likely have a profitable bluff in that scenario, despite holding the worst possible blockers. Let's list one final problem, and the problem is that when our opponent bets the river, he's not correctly polarized and he's betting overly thin for value. For example, perhaps he's trying to value bet some second pair type hands. Remember how we said that we have this equivalency of bluff catchers against a polarized range, where top pair good kicker is essentially equivalent to worst possible pair aside from card removal effects? Well, that no longer applies. If our opponent is merging, then it means that a stronger bluff catcher in the absolute sense will nearly always outperform a weaker bluff catcher. In other words, top pair good kicker is going to be a much better bluff catcher than pocket twos, because it's no longer about card removal effects, It's purely about what percentage of our opponent's range do we beat. We refer to this as merging, by the way, when our opponent is betting overly thin. And it's something we observe when we look at pool data. We see that the average river betting range contains a decent amount of merges. What that means in practice for us is that our bluff catching range should not be defined by the quality of our blocker. It should actually be defined by the absolute strength of our bluff catcher. In other words, top pair good kicker is always going to be a better bluff catch than bottom pair weak kicker. The stronger our bluff catcher in the absolute sense, the more profitable it's going to be as a bluff catcher. Notice that this is completely different from the theory approach to purely utilizing blockers to determine what's going to be a plus EV bluff catch or not. So let's think about the conclusions there. Depending on our opponent's leaks, we often find that when bluffing, usually all of our bluffs will be profitable, regardless of the card removal effect, or none of our bluffs will be profitable. Same thing with bluff catching. We often find that all of our bluff catches will be profitable in a certain situation, or none of them. But that's assuming our opponent's polarized. Of course, if our opponent is merged, as the average player might be, then we'll find that all of our bluff catches above a certain absolute strength will be profitable, whereas all of our bluff catches below a certain absolute strength will be non-profitable. Now, that's not always to say that it will be completely linear. There are going to be some very close hands right on the line where we might find that a slightly weaker bluff catcher is going to outperform a slightly stronger bluff catcher as a result of favorable card removal effects. But in general, if our opponent is merged, then we care a lot about the absolute strength of our bluff catcher and not so much about blocking effects. We can learn that we only really care about blockers if villain is defending very close to the correct frequency. For example, imagine our opponent is supposed to fold the river 40% of the time in a certain situation where we bluff. And let's just say our opponent is falling at exactly a 40% frequency, so a GTO correct defending frequency in that scenario. Well, now we do care about blockers, because blockers are going to make the difference between a profitable bluff and a non-profitable bluff. If we have favorable blockers, our opponent is actually going to be folding a little bit more often than 40%, which then generates a profitable bluff. If we have negative card removal effects with our blockers, now our opponent is going to be folding slightly less than the 40% of the time, which now means we have a minus EV bluff in that scenario. So in a very close situation where our opponent is defending right on the line of a theoretically correct defending frequency, now blockers should be the determining factor. But unless our opponent is very good, he's very often going to be either underfolding or overfolding, and we should just exploit that rather than becoming concerned about blockers. Now, the end goal of this discussion is not to say that you should ignore blockers. The goal really is to understand where blockers are relevant and only make use of blockers in those scenarios. And this is a fairly widespread problem, even if you have a look at the way that certain high-stakes players are approaching the game. Their decisions on the river are overly blocker-oriented. And although it will be okay against very advanced opponents to have a blocker-oriented approach, we don't want to take that same approach against weak opponents who are making clear mistakes in a river scenario. So let's think a little bit about how we know when river blocking effects are going to be relevant to our decision. One thing that I'd like you to focus on is to envision your blocking effect as a percentage of the total range. The basic idea here is that the later the street we're on, the larger the blocking effect will be of holding a single hand in Hold'em. Because when we look at blocking effects in solver output, we see that technically blocking effects exist throughout the whole game tree. There are decisions on the flop that the solver is basing around favorable blocking effects. There are even decisions pre-flop that the solver is basing around favorable blocking effects. But think about it this way, we always have two cards. And if we think about a single raised heads up pot scenario, it's possible that each player has in the order of about 300 combos that are seeing the flop, and we just hold two cards. If we compare that to a river situation, where depending on the exact action, we could easily have less than 50 combos reaching the river, perhaps even less than 30 combos reaching the river. And this is especially true if there is river action involved. It's one thing just reaching the river with less than 50 combos, but if there is then a bet and a 2-bet, We could be narrowing ranges down to less than 30 combos, maybe even less than 20 combos, depending on the precise action. So think about the impact that 2 cards that we hold in our hand is going to have on a 20 combo range compared to a 300 combo range. One is a drop in the ocean, the effect of 2 cards on a 300 combo range, whereas the other starts to become very significant. We hold 2 cards and the width of the ranges has now been reduced to 20 combos. What we can see from this is that although blocking effects do exist throughout the whole game tree, for the most part, we're really only interested in blocking effects on the river. Now, I'm not going to offer you any mathematical proof here. I'm just going to give you my opinion. My opinion is this: it's highly unlikely that blockers should play any practical role in our decision-making process on any street before the river. Now, you might disagree with that. That's fine. You might base a lot of your flop and turn decisions around blockers. That's 100% okay. You can play the game however you want to. My personal opinion is that you should not be thinking about blocking effects on any street before the river. It's just too small of an impact. It definitely is, in my opinion, more the realm of a computer solver. Computers can see these things. I think it's highly presumptive for a human player to assume they understand the relevant blocking effects on the flop and be able to utilize those effects when constructing their flop strategy. It implies that they have a much more granular understanding of their opponent's range than they can ever have in practice. And it also implies that they have a computational ability that is well beyond the computational ability of the average human being. In my opinion, we're talking about the realm of savants, but honestly, I think just the realm of computer solvers. This is not something that humans can see. They don't have the raw processing power for it, in my opinion. I do, however, think that specific river scenarios versus decent opponents who are playing close to the line may be an exception. We're starting to step into the realm of something that a human player can compute and potentially make use of. Specific river scenarios versus decent opponents, probably in fairly large pots as well. Why do I say large pots? Because generally speaking, the larger the pot, the more ranges have narrowed, and the more that a favorable card removal effect is going to impact on our opponent's calling, folding, or bluffing frequencies. So with that said, you do have a good reason to think about blockers in certain scenarios. However, let's highlight some problems with the typical approach to using blockers. There are some blind spots here which many players are not aware of, including players from a high stakes context. This is not necessarily something that's common knowledge. Okay, problem number 1 revolves around a lack of understanding that blocking effects are range-based. Let's think about a simple example. Let's imagine our opponent plays a bet check bet line. He's in position, he fires the flop, he checks the turn, then he fires the river. Now, the idea with this example hand is that there is a possible flush draw on the flop. It's a 2-tone texture. There are 2 hearts. The turn is a blank, but the river completes the heart draw. And we're trying to decide whether we should be bluff catching against our opponent's bet check bet line. We'll look down at our holdings and we see that we have a pair. Let's just imagine we have some arbitrarily low pair. Let's imagine our opponent is polarized, so we don't need to worry too much about him merging. We have a pair of 5s, but our side card is the ace of hearts. That means we have a nut flush blocker. What do many players do here? They look down at their whole cards and say, well, in this case, I'm blocking all of my opponent's nut flushes. This is an excellent bluff catcher. I'm going to call in this situation as a result of card removal effects. And it sounds very logical, and it's rare that discussions on blockers actually proceed beyond this point. But there's a problem here. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that if our opponent did have the nut flush draw, he wouldn't have taken a bet check bet line. Let's say this particular player always double barrels the turn if he has a nut flush draw. So all of a sudden, what exactly are we blocking? We're not blocking our opponent's nut flush draws. He doesn't have any. That's because blocking effects are range-based. It's only valuable to block a certain value hand if it's legitimately in our opponent's range. It's not just as simple as looking at our whole cards and saying, oh great, I have a nut flush blocker. That must mean this is a good bluff catcher. Actually, this is probably not a very good bluff catcher because of the fact that we hold the ace of hearts. Perhaps our opponent likes to fire a continuation bet on the flop with the backdoor one card nut flush draw, but will only continue on the turn if he picks up the flush draw. Assuming he bricks, he checks back and uses the hand as part of a stop and go line. In other words, we think we're blocking our opponent's value range. We're actually blocking his bluffing range. All of a sudden, a blocker which seems like a very obvious favorable blocker is actually a non-favorable blocker. It's not just a case of seeing that we block one of the main draws that gets there. We have to interpret blockers in the context of our opponent's range. If he doesn't play nut flushes this way, there is no value blocking the nut flush because we're not blocking part of his range. I'm hoping when you hear it explained that it's actually really obvious that just because we block the nut flush doesn't automatically mean that we have a good blocker. But I don't hear discussions on blockers proceed beyond a very, very basic level where a player looks down and says, okay, possible flush, I blocked that. This must be a good bluff catcher. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. It's more complex than players understand. Let's think about another example. This is what I refer to as the rock, paper, scissors of blockers. And it's a fairly theoretical, I would say fairly heavy advanced concept. But in some senses, it's once again computer realm. It's not really human computational realm. Something that we perhaps don't really need to care about, but it helps to illustrate why understanding relevant blockers or understanding which blockers are favorable is not as straightforward as players would have you believe. Now we're going to keep this very simple and generic. We can't have any complex examples on the screen. I understand this is a podcast, so let's just keep this very simple. Let's imagine it's a board where a straight draw has completed. So there's a possible straight out there by the river. And let's just say we decide to deliberately try and bluff with hands that have a straight blocker. For example, there's a 5, 7, and 9 out there. It probably makes sense to hold an 8 because it decreases the combination of 6, 8 our opponent can have. Just as a very basic example. Deliberately choosing hands that block the possible straight. But here's where things get kind of interesting. Think about it from our opponent's perspective. What is he trying to do? Well, he wants us to have as few combinations of the straight as possible. So he's deliberately bluff catching with hands that also have straight blockers. Guess what? He's blocking our bluffing range. That's bad for him. Something that seems like an obviously good blocker is not necessarily a good blocker. Remember what we said? It depends on the opponent's range. We're deliberately bluffing with straight blocker type hands. So if our opponent's deliberately bluff catching with straight blocker type hands, he's blocking our bluffing range. The end result is that we might find that according to a solver, he's actually now incentivized to bluff catch holdings without the straight blockers in order to keep our bluffing range as wide as possible because we're deliberately using hands that have straight blockers as part of our bluffing range. But guess what? He goes a step further. You see, previously, by deliberately bluffing with hands that have straight blockers, we were actually blocking our opponent's bluff catching range. But he's now shifted that to include hands that don't have straight blockers. We might now be incentivized to shift our bluffing range to block villains' bluff catches, even though those bluffs don't have straight blockers. You can see there's actually a rock, paper, scissors that's going on with our blocker selection. This is not a static hand selection process. Each player is adjusting their blocker selection with a clairvoyant view of their opponent's blocker selection. At least that's how a solver works. The end result is that we see mixing of blockers. So we reach some type of equilibrium where we're shifting between which types of hands we use as bluffs. We often end up with a mixture of two different types of bluffs, even though one of those bluffs doesn't seem to make any sense because it doesn't seem to have relevant blockers. So sometimes the end result is mixing. Sometimes the end result is complete inversion of what we'd expect as being a good blocker when bluffing. So we might think, naturally, a straight blocker makes sense here, but we find that the solver doesn't bluff with those hands. It actually bluffs with hands that don't have straight blockers. So you can see it's not as straightforward as just saying, okay, we block this hand, this must be a good bluff. It depends. In GTO land, our opponent knows how we're trying to construct our blocking range and is actively adjusting to that. We're iterating back and forth until we reach an equilibrium. I don't know if the average player knows this. I just know that I've never heard it mentioned anywhere. And every discussion I hear on blockers is usually very, very straightforward level 1, as in, we block the straight, this must be a good blocker in this spot. Once again, I would say it's fairly presumptive or assumptive as a human to assume that we automatically know what the best blockers are in a certain river bluff situation. You can guess, but you don't know. Ranges are too complex for that. You do not have the computational power. If you do, you're a savant. You are the 0.1% of the 1%. Now, does that mean that we should not even try, right? It's too difficult. The computation is not approachable for a human. Let's just disregard blockers. I would say no. I would say based on those very, very simple rules that your best guess is probably going to be right above 50% of the time. Besides, your opponent is not trying to adjust against your blocker choices as a solver would do when iterating against itself. In other words, blocker selection in practice is probably slightly more static than it would be in an equilibrium. So I would say make your best guess in close spots. You're going to be completely wrong some of the time. You might think you have a good blocker, but based on your opponent's range construction, you actually have an anti-blocker. That's fine. If you are right more than 50% of the time, you are increasing your win rate by thinking about blockers. So I would say make your best guess anyway in close spots, especially river bluffs and especially river raise scenarios. So river raising as a bluff is a fairly important part of the game. It's much more important than it used to be. And I would say making your best guess in close spots when choosing river bluff raise candidates is going to have an impact on your win rate. And it can make the difference between a plus EV river bluff raise and a minus EV river bluff raise. Sometimes you'll be wrong with your blocker selection. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try and guess. It just takes humility to understand that you don't fully know whether your blocker is as favorable as you think it is. But if you're right more than 50% of the time, it's worth it. It is technically boosting your win rate in the long run. We can also use blockers to help us randomize. For example, imagine we had an opponent who is folding slightly too much against river bet, so we can exploit this player. He's not defending optimally from a theory perspective, maybe even for exploitative reasons on his part. For example, he thinks the player pool is under bluffing in a certain situation. So we have an opponent who's slightly overfolding, but we also have the belief that if we bluff every single time, that our opponent is going to figure out that we're over bluffing and may adjust his game plan to counter exploit us. So we decide that we want to bluff more than theory says that we should, but we don't want to bluff every time. So how would we decide which hands to bluff and when to pass up on the profitable bluff? Well, it makes sense to randomize via our approximation of favorable blockers. In other words, we make our best guess. If we think our blocker is favorable for a bluff, we pull a trigger. If we think it's non-favorable, we don't pull a trigger. We slightly lean towards bluffing in close spots because we want to generate an above optimal bluff to value ratio. We do want to over bluff slightly as an exploit, but we use the blocker estimation as a vehicle for randomization within a certain constraint. But if there's one thing that you should take away from this session, it's that you should not consult blockers in spots that are not close, just because it's a theoretical part of the game. If your opponent never folds the river, it does not matter if you have a good blocker. He's still never going to fold the river. Or if your opponent folds the river 90% of the time, it does not matter that your blockers are terrible. Your opponent is still going to dramatically overfold in that river scenario. Most river scenarios are not close enough where you need to consult blockers. And if they are, it implies that you are already playing against some of the best players in the world in high stakes / nosebleed environment. And even in some of those environments, you'll find that blockers are only incentivized in certain river situations. One small tip just to finish off is if you are in a river situation where you think blocking effects are relevant, look out for the double straight blocker. This can sometimes be a nice indication that you should be running a bluff. For example, you have a 9-7-5 texture. Now, obviously, it could be favorable to hold a 6 or an 8 in that scenario because it means our opponent has less combinations of the 8-6 straight. But what if we hold something like pocket sixes? We have a much bigger impact on the number of straight combinations our opponent has when we have a double blocker to the nuts. So paying attention to that kind of situation may sometimes indicate that it's a good spot for a river bluff raise. Well, congratulations, you made it to the end of that slightly heavier discussion on blockers. Hope you found it entertaining. Thanks very much for listening. This is Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.